The first thing I heard wasn't applause. It was my mother's voice. "You should have worn something normal." She didn't say it loudly. She didn't need to. She leaned close enough that only I was supposed to hear it, but weddings have strange acoustics. Conversations drift. Laughter pauses. Someone always catches the sentence that was never meant for them. I looked at her without answering. She adjusted the collar of my dress uniform, as if she were fixing something embarrassing instead of something honorable. "You're not my daughter," she whispered, her smile never leaving her face for the photographers. "You're just a disappointment." The people closest to us laughed. Not because they thought it was cruel. Because they assumed it was true. I stood there wearing the uniform I had earned through 11 years, 4 months, and 16 days of military service. Every medal on my chest had been awarded after months of training, deployments that kept me away from home for nearly 800 nights, and decisions that still woke me up at 3 in the morning. Yet none of that mattered inside that banquet hall. All anyone seemed to notice was that my uniform looked out of place, beside matching bridesmaid dresses. I smiled. Not because it didn't hurt. Because I suddenly understood something I should have learned years earlier. Some rooms only know how to measure worth using the ruler they've always held. I turned toward the exit before anyone realized I had made a decision. But this story doesn't start here. Welcome back to Revenge Cold Stories. Drop your first name and your city in the comments and subscribe before we go any further. My name is Emma Carter. I'm 34 years old now. 3 years have passed since that wedding. When people read my service record today, they usually begin with the awards. The Distinguished Service Medal. The Joint Operations Leadership Citation. The Humanitarian Command Recognition. The National Military Excellence Award. Those are the headlines. The real story begins much earlier, in a yellow house with peeling paint where achievement only counted if my younger sister earned it first. I was 7 years old the first time I understood that effort and recognition weren't always connected. Dad had built 2 small wooden birdhouses from leftover fence boards. One was slightly larger than the other. He handed the bigger one to my sister, Lily, who was 5. "This one suits our little princess." He passed me the smaller one. "You don't mind, you're practical." I didn't. Not then. Children have a remarkable ability to believe every unequal decision is somehow logical. My mother, Susan, believed fairness wasn't treating everyone equally. Fairness, according to her, meant giving more attention to whoever needed it most. The problem was that Lily always seemed to need more. If Lily received an 82 on a spelling test, we celebrated because she'd worked so hard. If I received 100, Mother smiled politely. "We expected that." Those 3 words shaped more of my childhood than anyone realized. We expected that. Success became invisible because it was predictable. Failure became unforgettable because it was unexpected. Dad wasn't cruel. Neither was Mother. That's the complicated part. People imagine painful families as loud places full of shouting. Ours was quiet. Orderly. Respectable. Mother volunteered at church every Thursday. Dad coached youth baseball for 9 years. They paid every bill on time. They remembered birthdays. They simply loved us differently. Mother worried constantly about Lily. She thought confidence was fragile. Every disappointment had to be softened. Every mistake explained away. Every criticism redirected toward someone safer. That someone usually became me. Emma understands. Emma is mature. Emma doesn't need encouragement. Children hear those sentences differently than adults intend them. I translated them into one simple belief. No one is coming. If I wanted confidence, I would have to build it myself. When I turned 14, I started running before school. Not because anyone told me to. Because running was honest. The stopwatch didn't care which daughter Mother preferred. A hill didn't become less steep because someone smiled prettier. Distance couldn't be negotiated. Every morning at 5:15, I tied the same worn shoes and ran exactly 6.2 miles around our neighborhood. The first month hurt. The second month felt possible. By the sixth month, I understood discipline wasn't something people were born with. It was something repeated until it became identity. Dad noticed first. "You've gotten fast." That was all he said. Oddly enough, it meant everything. Lily hated mornings. She hated exercise. She loved music, theatre, conversations that lasted hours, and making strangers feel like lifelong friends within 5 minutes. She wasn't lazy. She simply valued different things. Looking back now, I don't think she wanted our parents to compare us. She benefited from it. But benefiting isn't always the same as creating it. Mother often compared us without realizing it. "Why can't you smile like Lily?" Then 5 minutes later, "Why can't you stay focused like Emma?" Neither of us won. We simply lost in different directions. High school made the differences impossible to ignore. I graduated with a 3.96 GPA. Captain of the cross-country team. Student Leadership Council. Volunteer coordinator with nearly 400 documented service hours. Mother attended graduation. She spent most of it telling relatives how nervous Lily was about her upcoming theatre audition. At dinner that evening, my aunt raised a glass. "Emma, congratulations." Before I could answer, Mother laughed softly. "Now we just have to make sure she remembers life isn't all about achievements." Everyone nodded. I remember wondering how celebrating graduation had somehow become a lecture. That night, I searched military academies online for the first time. Not because I dreamed of medals. Because every requirement was written clearly. Physical fitness. Academic scores. Leadership evaluations. No hidden rules. No favorite child. No emotional mathematics. Just standards. I applied to 3 programs. Received offers from 2. Accepted one without asking anyone's permission. Mother cried. Not proud tears. Fearful ones. The military changes people. She wasn't entirely wrong. It does. It strips away excuses before rebuilding confidence. During officer training, 43 candidates began. 36 graduated. I finished 4th overall. Top 10% in tactical assessment. 2nd in endurance. Highest score in crisis leadership simulation. When I called home, Mother answered after 4 rings. "That's nice." Then, "Did I tell you Lily got the lead role in the community production?" I congratulated my sister. I meant it. Still, after hanging up, I sat on my bunk staring at my phone for almost 20 minutes. Not because Mother mentioned Lily. Because she never asked how I felt. That question remained strangely absent throughout my life. How are you? Are you happy? Was it difficult? What scared you? Those questions were reserved for my sister. I received different ones. When are you visiting? Will you wear the uniforms? Can you help your cousin with college applications? Useful questions. Practical questions. Never personal ones. Years passed. Deployments came and went. I learned to lead teams under pressure. I learned that calm voices often save more lives than loud ones. I learned that recognition inside the military usually arrives months after the work is finished. That suited me. I wasn't chasing applause anymore. I was chasing competence. By 31, I had supervised operations involving more than 100 personnel. Completed over 2,000 hours of advanced leadership training. Managed emergency logistics during 3 natural disasters. Received performance evaluations describing me as exceptionally reliable under sustained operational stress. Mother framed none of those reports. She did frame Lily's wedding invitation. Gold lettering. Ivory paper. Silk ribbon. It stayed on the living room table for nearly 4 months. My invitation arrived by ordinary mail. Inside was a handwritten note. Please wear something elegant instead of your work clothes. I stared at that sentence for a long time. Work clothes. That was what my uniform represented to her. Not service. Not sacrifice. Just clothing. I almost declined. Then Dad called. It would mean a lot if you came. He sounded tired. Older. I said yes. Not because I expected anything different. Because I still believed showing up mattered. I had no idea that one whispered sentence would quietly divide my life into before and after. The wedding was scheduled for the second Saturday in June. I requested leave 42 days in advance. Military schedules don't bend easily, and at that point I was coordinating a regional training exercise involving nearly 200 personnel across 3 installations. Rearranging my responsibilities required 3 officers, 6 updated operational briefs, and more paperwork than I cared to remember. When my leave was approved, my commanding officer, Colonel David Harrison, handed me the signed authorization. Family weddings. Yes, sir. He smiled. Try to forget we're all here for at least 3 days. I'll do my best. As I walked toward the door, he stopped me. And Emma. I turned. Don't apologize for wearing the uniform if circumstances require it. I remember thinking it was an odd thing to say. At the time, I didn't realize how often experienced leaders recognize battles before the people walking into them. 2 weeks before the ceremony, Mother called. Not to ask when I was arriving. Not to ask whether the drive would be safe. Her first question was different. Do you own a regular dress? I do. A nice one. Yes. Silence. I'd rather you wore that. My leave ends the morning after the wedding. I'll be traveling directly back to base. You could change. I won't have time. Another pause. You always make everything complicated. I almost laughed. Logistics weren't complicated. Changing into civilian clothes in a hotel after formal photographs, then driving 5 hours overnight before reporting back to duty at 6:30 in the morning. That was complicated. Keeping my uniform on wasn't. But I had learned years earlier that explaining practical decisions to someone who had already reached an emotional conclusion rarely changed anything. I'll see you Saturday. She sighed. I suppose. That word stayed with me. Suppose. Not I'm glad you're coming. Not travel safely. Just reluctant acceptance. I arrived in my hometown on Friday evening at 7:18. Nothing had changed. The bakery still closed at 5. The hardware store still displayed flower pots outside. Mrs. Henderson still watered the same roses she'd planted when I was in middle school. Small towns preserve routines the way museums preserve photographs. When I checked into the hotel, the receptionist looked at my identification. She smiled. My son joined the Navy last year. I smiled back. You must be proud. I am. She didn't ask what medals meant. She didn't salute. She simply said something I hadn't heard from my own family in years. Thank you for your service. 4 ordinary words. Yet somehow they landed with surprising weight. Saturday morning began with rain. A soft summer rain that disappeared before noon, leaving the sidewalks shining beneath warm sunlight. The church looked exactly as I remembered. White brick. Blue stained glass windows. Wooden doors polished so often they reflected the people entering. Inside, cousins I hadn't seen for years greeted me politely. Some recognized the uniform immediately. Others stared at the ribbons, trying to guess what each one represented. My Uncle Robert approached first. Zemma. He shook my hand firmly. It's good seeing you. You too. He glanced at the medals. I don't pretend to understand all of those, but you've clearly been busy. There wasn't admiration in his voice. Just genuine curiosity. I appreciated that. A few minutes later, Lily appeared. She looked beautiful. Not because bridal magazines would have approved, though they probably would have. She looked beautiful because she was genuinely excited. Her smile reached her eyes. She hugged me carefully. I was afraid you'd get called back. So was I. She stepped back and looked at me. The uniform suits you. Simple. Honest. No hidden criticism. For a moment, I saw the little sister who used to sneak cookies into my room after Mother grounded me for staying out too late at track practice. Whatever had happened between our parents and me had never fully happened between Lily and me. Distance had complicated things. Comparison had complicated things. But kindness had survived. I'm glad you're here, she whispered. So am I. Then Mother appeared. Her expression changed the moment she noticed the uniform. Not anger. Embarrassment. The kind someone feels when they believe another person has violated an unwritten social rule. There you are. She kissed my cheek, then immediately began adjusting my sleeves. You really couldn't change. No. She forced another smile as relatives approached. I suppose everyone has to make a statement. It isn't a statement. It certainly attracts attention. People nearby pretended not to hear. Families become experts at pretending. Dad walked over carrying 2 boxes of ceremony programs. He looked older than the last time I'd seen him. Maury grey hair. Softer shoulders. But his smile remained the same. You made it. I did. He hugged me tightly. Then he stepped back and quietly straightened the ribbon bar above my pocket. Unlike Mother, he wasn't trying to hide it. He simply wanted it perfectly aligned. There. He nodded once. Looks good. It was perhaps the closest thing to pride he had ever openly shown. The ceremony itself passed peacefully. Lily cried during her vows. Half the audience cried with her. Her husband, Michael, forgot one line and laughed at himself. Everyone laughed too. It felt real. Messy. Human. The kind of wedding people remember fondly because it wasn't perfect. During photographs, I noticed Mother directing people almost like a stage manager. Cousins first. Grandparents in the center. Taller people in the back. Then she looked toward me. Emma. She hesitated. Maybe stand near the edge. The uniform draws the eye. There it was again. Not outright rejection. Just repositioning. Always repositioning. Always somewhere slightly outside the frame. I moved without arguing. The photographer raised his camera. Everyone smiled. Click. The image probably still exists somewhere. 32 people. One daughter standing just far enough away to be cropped out if necessary. The reception began an hour later in a ballroom overlooking a small lake. Round tables. White flowers. Soft piano music. Waiters carrying trays of sparkling drinks. Everything looked elegant without feeling extravagant. Mother moved effortlessly from group to group. Introducing guests. Accepting compliments. Telling stories. I noticed something interesting. Whenever someone asked about me, she answered quickly before changing the subject. Emma works for the military. Then immediately. Lily planned every flower arrangement herself. Lord, the honeymoon will be in Italy. Lord, Michael just received a promotion. I wasn't hidden. Just minimized. Like a footnote interrupting the narrative she preferred telling. It would have bothered me years earlier. Now it mostly made me curious. How long had this pattern existed without my noticing? Probably longer than I wanted to admit. During dinner, I found myself seated beside my cousin Daniel. He leaned closer. I looked up your rank. You did. I was curious. He lowered his voice. You're kind of a big deal, aren't you? I laughed. No, Emma. I promise. He grinned. That's exactly what someone important would say. Before I could answer, Mother appeared beside our table. There you are. She smiled toward Daniel. I hope Emma isn't boring you with military stories. Daniel blinked. Actually, I was asking. Mother interrupted gently. You know how serious she is. Then she walked away before either of us spoke again. Daniel watched her disappear into the crowd. Did that just happen? I nodded once. It happens more often than you'd think. He looked genuinely confused. I don't understand. Neither did I. Not completely. Not yet. But I had stopped trying to solve every mystery years ago. Some people don't diminish others because they hate them. They do it because they've repeated the habit for so long it feels like ordinary conversation. That realization hurt more than deliberate cruelty ever could. Cruelty at least acknowledges your presence. Habit barely notices you're there. By the time dessert was served, the ballroom had settled into that comfortable rhythm every successful wedding eventually finds. The formal schedule was over. The photographer had stopped arranging people into neat rows. Children were chasing each other between tables despite their parents' half-hearted attempts to stop them. Older relatives had gathered near the coffee station to compare stories they had already told each other dozens of times over the years. The band had switched from slow instrumental music to familiar classics that encouraged people onto the dance floor without demanding it. I watched quietly from my table. Military life teaches you to observe before reacting. Crowded rooms become easier to understand when you stop trying to be seen inside them. Lily and Michael were dancing. Dad looked happier than I had seen him in years. For a few minutes, I let myself believe the evening might simply end with uncomfortable conversations and nothing more. Then my mother picked up a champagne glass. She tapped it gently with a spoon. The room gradually became quiet. I just want to say a few words. Applause. She smiled warmly at the guests. First, thank you all for celebrating our beautiful Lily and Michael today. Maury applause. She spoke naturally. Confidently. She thanked relatives who had traveled long distances. She thanked friends who had helped organize the reception. She thanked the church volunteers. Then her eyes found me. There are so many different paths children choose. People nodded politely. As parents, all we can do is hope they become the people we dreamed they would become. Something inside me became strangely still. Not anxious. Still, I'd learned to recognize that feeling during operational briefings. It usually arrived a few seconds before something important happened. Mother laughed softly. Lily has always had the biggest heart. The guests smiled. She reminds people that kindness matters more than ambition. Another ripple of agreement moved through the room. Then came the comparison. It isn't always easy when siblings grow into such different people. Someone near the front chuckled. Mother continued. Some children build families. She looked toward Lily. Others. Her eyes returned to me. In collect titles. A few people laughed. Not loudly. Just enough. She wasn't finished. I suppose uniforms impress strangers. Maury laughed. But they don't impress mothers. Someone at another table actually clapped. Not because they understood what was happening. Because they assumed this was affectionate family humor. Mother tilted her head slightly. Then came the sentence. The one that divided my life into before and after. You're not my daughter. She paused just long enough for the silence to deepen. You're just a disappointment. The words weren't shouted. They were almost gentle. That made them infinitely sharper. For one impossible second, nobody reacted. Then a few uncomfortable laughs escaped around the room. Someone whispered, "Zoe." Another person looked down at their plate. Daniel stopped eating. Dad stared at Mother, as though she had begun speaking a language he didn't recognize. Lily's smile disappeared instantly. I looked around the ballroom. 112 guests. Crystal chandeliers. White roses. Golden evening sunlight reflecting across the lake outside. I remember every detail, because shock has a strange way of preserving ordinary moments forever. Mother was still smiling, waiting for people to laugh with her. Some did. Not because they were cruel. Because social situations are confusing. People often laugh simply because everyone else appears to be laughing. No one wants to become the first person to admit something wasn't funny. I stood slowly. Every chair scraping against the floor suddenly sounded louder than the conversation. Mother looked relieved. Perhaps she expected me to joke back. Perhaps she imagined I would rescue the moment. Instead, I smiled. A real smile. Small, calm, almost peaceful. I hope Lily has a wonderful marriage. My voice carried easily through the room. I looked toward my sister. You deserve every happiness. She had tears in her eyes. I turned toward Michael. Take care of each other. He nodded once. Then I looked at Dad. He seemed unable to move. Finally, I looked back at Mother. There were 1,000 things I could have said. 11 years of missed birthdays. Countless conversations cut short. Achievements dismissed. Comparisons repeated until they became family tradition. None of them mattered anymore. Some arguments end because one person wins. Others end because someone quietly decides they no longer wish to participate. I picked up my service cap from the chair beside me, placed it carefully beneath my arm, and walked toward the exit. No dramatic speech. No tears. No slammed doors. Just footsteps. Steady. Measured. The same pace I'd learned years earlier during ceremonial marches. Behind me, I heard someone call my name. Dad. I didn't stop. Not because I was angry. Because if I stopped, someone would ask me to stay. To understand. To forgive. To keep the peace. For 31 years, I had mistaken keeping the peace for sacrificing myself. Outside, evening air replaced the heavy warmth of the ballroom. The lake was perfectly still. I stood there for almost 5 minutes without moving. Then my phone vibrated. Lily. I answered. I'm sorry. She was crying. So am I. I didn't know. I know. I tried to tell Mom not to. Her voice broke. I know. You aren't a disappointment. I closed my eyes. I know. That answer surprised even me. Because for the first time in my life, I actually believed it. We spoke for another 8 minutes. Not about Mother. Not about the wedding. Just about ordinary things. The drive back. Her honeymoons. Whether I'd eaten enough. It was the most honest conversation we'd ever had. When we hung up, I blocked exactly one phone number. My mother's. Not out of revenge. Out of necessity. Some doors aren't locked to punish the people outside them. They're locked so the people inside can finally rest. I drove back to base that night. 5 hours. 311 miles. The roads were nearly empty. Around 1:30 in the morning, I stopped at a roadside diner. The waitress noticed my uniform. Long trip. Yes. She poured fresh coffee. Heading home. I thought about the question longer than necessary. Then I smiled faintly. No, I'm heading forward. She didn't understand why those words mattered. Neither did I completely. Not yet. But somewhere between that quiet diner and the first hint of sunrise over the highway, I realized something simple. Home isn't always the place that raised you. Sometimes it's the place that finally allows you to become yourself. By 6:25 that morning, I was back on base. At 6:30, I was standing in the operations room, reviewing logistics for the week's training schedule. No one asked why my eyes looked tired. Military life rarely leaves room for personal explanations. Colonel Harrison entered carrying a folder. "You made it back." "Yes, sir." "How was the wedding?" I considered the question. It was educational. He studied my face for several seconds. Experienced officers learn to read silence better than words. He didn't press further. Instead, he placed the folder in front of me. "We've received confirmation." I opened it. Inside was a deployment leadership assignment I'd been hopping for nearly 2 years. Complex. Demanding. The type of responsibility awarded only to officers trusted under extreme pressure. "You earned this." I nodded. "Thank you, sir." As I left his office, I realized something almost ironic. The same weekend, my family had laughed at my uniform. The institution that had watched me work every single day had quietly trusted me with the greatest responsibility of my career so far. Recognition, I was beginning to understand, rarely arrives from the people determined not to see you. It usually comes from those who have been watching all along. The assignment changed the pace of my life almost immediately. Within 72 hours, my office moved from the second floor of the administrative building to the Joint Operations Center. My calendar, which had already been full, became something that looked less like a schedule and more like a carefully managed emergency. Morning briefings at 600. Planning sessions at 8:30. Coordination calls with regional commands before lunch. Field inspections in the afternoon. After-action reviews that often stretched well into the evening. Some weeks averaged 80 hours. A few quietly crossed 90. Oddly enough, I slept better than I had in years. Not because the work was easy. Because purpose has a way of exhausting the mind without burdening the conscience. Nobody inside the operations center cared whether I smiled enough. Nobody asked why I wasn't married. Nobody suggested my career was simply a phase. If I solved problems, people trusted me. If I made mistakes, they expected me to correct them. It was demanding. It was unforgiving. It was also the healthiest environment I had ever known. About 3 months after the wedding, Colonel Harrison called me into his office again. He never wasted words. "Sit down." I did. He slid a performance evaluation across the desk. Normally those reports were 6 or 7 pages. This one was closer to 20. Attached were recommendations from officers I had worked with during disaster relief operations, multinational training exercises, and emergency logistics missions. "I've read every one of them," he said. "So have I. What do you notice?" I looked through the pages again. Not a single recommendation mentioned intelligence first, or discipline, or physical endurance. The same phrase kept appearing in different forms. "People trusted her." One officer wrote. When situations became uncertain, personnel naturally looked toward Captain Carter before looking toward higher headquarters. Another. Her calm communication prevented unnecessary escalation during multiple critical incidents. A third. She consistently gave credit to subordinates before accepting recognition herself. Colonel Harrison leaned back. "Leadership isn't about making people admire you." "I know, sir. It's about making them feel safe enough to do their jobs." He folded his hands. "You've learned that." Then he added something unexpected. "I don't know much about your family." I stayed quiet. "But I know enough to suspect someone spent years convincing you that your value depended on meeting impossible expectations." I looked at him. He wasn't guessing. He had seen it before. Good commanders often have. "You don't have to answer." I won't. He nodded. Fair enough. After a long pause, he smiled faintly. The military has a habit of adopting people who never quite fit anywhere else. That sentence stayed with me long after I left his office. Not because it was poetic. Because it was painfully accurate. Over the next year, our team coordinated 3 major emergency responses following severe flooding across 2 neighboring states. Nearly 18,000 residents required temporary shelter. Supply routes changed every few hours as roads disappeared beneath water. Communication towers failed. Hospitals requested emergency generators. Food distribution centers ran 24 hours a day. There were no television cameras following us. No dramatic speeches. Just thousands of ordinary decisions that had to be made correctly. One afternoon, after nearly 16 consecutive hours at the command center, a young lieutenant approached my desk. He looked exhausted. Ma'am, yes, I think I made a mistake. He had. A significant one. The kind that could delay medical supplies if ignored. He stood there waiting to be embarrassed. Waiting for the kind of public correction he'd probably experienced before. Instead, I asked one question. Can we still fix it? Yes. Good. We fixed it. The process took 43 minutes. When we finished, he apologized again. I should have known better. You know better now. He looked confused. That's different. He left looking noticeably lighter. Later that evening, another officer asked why I hadn't formally reprimanded him. He admitted the mistake before anyone found it. So, if honesty gets punished exactly the same way as dishonesty, people stop being honest. The officer thought about that for a moment. I hadn't considered that. Neither had I. Not consciously. Until that conversation. Driving back to my quarters that night, I realized I had been leading people in the exact opposite way I'd been raised. At home, mistakes received attention. Success became expected. Inside my unit, I tried to notice effort before perfection. I praised improvement. I corrected behavior without attacking identity. Somewhere along the way, without intending to, I had built the kind of environment I had always wanted as a child. That realization was both comforting and heartbreaking. Christmas arrived. For the first time in my life, I didn't go home. Mother sent no message. Neither did I. Dad mailed a short card. It contained only 3 sentences. Merry Christmas. I hope you're healthy. I'm proud of the work you're doing. I read those words several times. He had crossed out the phrase "I'm proud of you" before rewriting it more carefully. I could still see the faint marks beneath the ink. Old habits don't disappear overnight. Sometimes people can only express love in the smallest safe increments. I kept the card anyway. Lily called on Christmas evening. She and Michael had rented a tiny cabin in the mountains. We built a terrible snowman. I'd expect nothing less. She laughed. I miss you. I miss you too. She hesitated. Mum still thinks you'll call eventually. I know. Will you? I looked out the window toward the parade ground, now covered in a thin layer of snow. No. Another pause. I don't think she understands why. I don't think she does either. Lily sighed. I wish things were different. So do I. Neither of us blamed the other. That mattered. Relationships don't always survive difficult families. Ours somehow had. Mostly because we stopped pretending the past hadn't happened. The following spring, I received another promotion. With it came greater responsibility, more personnel, and a small office with a window overlooking the training grounds. The office itself wasn't impressive. Metal shelves. Government-issued desk. 2 filing cabinets older than I was. But every morning I watched young recruits running across the field before sunrise. Some struggled. Some excelled. Most simply kept moving. Whenever possible, I walked outside after morning briefings. Not to inspect them. To encourage them. One recruit reminded me of myself at 19. Always arriving 15 minutes early. Always convinced one mistake would erase 10 successes. After one particularly difficult training exercise, she approached me. "Ma'am, go ahead. Can I ask something personal? If it's appropriate." "Were you always confident?" I almost smiled. "No. You seem like you never doubt yourself." "I doubt myself all the time." She blinked. "Really? The difference is that doubt no longer gets to make decisions." She stood quietly, thinking about that. Then she nodded once. "Thank you." As she walked away, I remembered another young woman. 17 years old. Standing in a kitchen after bringing home perfect grades. Waiting for someone to say they were proud. Waiting so long she eventually stopped expecting it. If I could spare even one person from carrying that feeling into adulthood, then every difficult year of my own life had created something worthwhile. Pain doesn't become meaningful because it happened. It becomes meaningful only when it teaches us to stop passing it to someone else. I didn't know then that 3 years after walking out of my sister's wedding, the quiet life I had carefully rebuilt was about to intersect with my family's once again. Not because I reached back toward them, but because recognition has a strange habit of becoming impossible to hide once enough people have witnessed it. 3 years passed more quickly than I expected. Not because life slowed down. Because meaningful work has a strange habit of measuring time in milestones instead of months. New officers arrived. Experienced ones retired. Some of the young lieutenants I had mentored earned promotions of their own. A few even began disagreeing with me during planning meetings. Oddly enough, that made me proud. Confident leaders don't create followers forever. They create people capable of thinking independently. By the beginning of my 14th year of service, I was overseeing operations that involved more than 600 personnel across multiple commands. The paperwork had multiplied. So had the responsibility. Every signature carried consequences. Every recommendation affected someone's career. Every evaluation became part of a permanent record. I had learned something my younger self would never have believed. Authority isn't satisfying. Responsibility is heavy. Recognition may look glamorous from a distance, but it usually arrives attached to sleepless nights and impossible decisions. One Tuesday afternoon, while reviewing quarterly readiness reports, my executive assistant knocked gently on my office door. "Ma'am, come in." She carried a sealed envelope with the official crest of the Ministry of Defense. "I think you'll want to open this yourself." Government envelopes rarely contain surprises. They usually contain deadlines. Or additional paperwork. I thanked her and opened it carefully. Inside was a formal letter. I read the first paragraph once. Then again. Then a third time. Finally, I placed it on my desk and simply stared out the window. A few moments later, my assistant spoke carefully. "Good news." "I believe so." She smiled. "Permission to be curious." I handed her the letter. Her eyes widened almost immediately. "So?" She looked back at me. "This is..." She searched for the right word. "Extraordinary." The letter informed me that I had been selected to receive the National Military Excellence Award for Distinguished Leadership during joint humanitarian operations and sustained operational command. The recognition wasn't based on one dramatic event. It reflected years of service. Years of decisions made quietly. Years of teams succeeding together. The ceremony would take place in the capital 6 weeks later. Attendance required. Dress uniform mandatory. Recipients confidential until the official announcement. I folded the letter again. The room felt strangely quiet. Not because I was overwhelmed. Because the moment belonged to hundreds of people besides me. Every instructor who had corrected me. Every soldier who had trusted my judgment. Every mentor who had refused to lower expectations simply because something was difficult. Achievements are rarely individual. Awards simply have limited space for engraving names. That evening, Colonel Harrison asked me to stop by his office. Apparently, news travelled faster than confidentiality notices. He closed the door after I entered. I heard a rumour. So did I. He laughed. Congratulations. Thank you, sir. He walked toward the window. You know what interests me most. I waited. The award isn't actually the achievement. No. He turned back toward me. The achievement happened years before anyone decided to recognize it. I considered that. He continued. People often confuse applause with accomplishment. He pointed toward the framed commendations hanging on his wall. Every one of those represents work that was already finished. Recognition follows reality. It doesn't create it. That distinction matters. Especially if you've spent your life waiting for someone else's approval. His words settled somewhere deep inside me. Because he had unknowingly described my childhood in 2 sentences. For years I had believed recognition created worth. The military had taught me the opposite. Worth existed long before anyone acknowledged it. The ceremony preparations remained surprisingly ordinary. Uniform inspection. Travel authorization. Accommodation details. Security briefings. Rehearsal schedule. Official photographers. Protocol officers. Every detail planned with military precision. 2 weeks before the event, I received another envelope. This one contained the seating chart. Recipients would sit in the front rows. Senior commanders behind us. Cabinet officials. Military families. Veterans. Invited civilian guests. I glanced at the section reserved for family members. Each recipient could invite 2 guests. The line remained blank. I set the paper aside without thinking much about it. Later that afternoon, my assistant entered carrying coffee. You haven't filled in your guest names. I probably won't. She looked surprised. No family. I have family. She understood immediately. I'm sorry. Don't be. She hesitated. What about someone from your unit? I thought about it. Then smiled. They've already celebrated every success with me. She laughed softly. I suppose that's true. The invitation remained blank for another week. Until Lily called. We spoke every month now. Never on a schedule. Always naturally. She sounded excited. You'll never guess. I probably won't. I saw something online. What? A military awards ceremony next month. I smiled to myself. Yes. You're involved somehow. I am. She became very quiet. Emma. I can't discuss details. Another pause. Then, can I ask one question? Of course. Are you okay? I closed my eyes briefly. It was still amazing how powerful those 4 words felt. I'm doing well. I'm glad. She took a careful breath. Mom and Dad have been invited. That caught my attention. Invited. There are community allocation tickets through Dad's Veterans Association. I didn't know. They think someone from Dad's old regiment is being honored. I leaned back in my chair. I see. They have no idea. No. Lily laughed quietly. I almost told them. I'm glad you didn't. Why? Because surprises belong to life. Not people. Not revenge. Just life. She grew thoughtful. Do you think Mom will finally understand? I looked at the blank guest invitation lying on my desk. No, you don't. I think she'll understand what happened. I paused. I don't know if she'll understand why. Those are different things. People often recognize consequences long before they recognize patterns. After we ended the call, I finally completed the guest form. Not with my parents' names. Not even with Lily's. Instead, I invited Colonel Harrison and Sergeant Major Elena Brooks, the two people who had shaped more of my professional life than anyone else over the previous decade. When Colonel Harrison received the invitation, he walked into my office carrying it. You've made a mistake. I don't think so. Family should sit there. I smiled gently. They are. For the first time since I'd known him, the Colonel seemed unable to find an immediate reply. He simply nodded once. Quietly. Respectfully. Sometimes gratitude doesn't need long speeches. Sometimes a single invitation says everything. The capital always felt different from every other city. Not louder. More intentional. Every street seemed designed for ceremonies, history and decisions that affected people far beyond the buildings where they were made. I arrived 2 days before the awards ceremony. Military protocol required every recipient to attend rehearsals, security briefings and formal inspections. The schedule arrived the moment I checked into the hotel. 700 uniform inspection. 8:30 ceremony rehearsal. 1100 media guidance. 1400 recipient briefing. 1700 reception with senior leadership. Everything was timed to the minute. No surprises. Exactly the kind of environment that allowed people to focus on responsibility instead of uncertainty. The rehearsal took place inside the National Military Hall. It was larger than I had imagined. Rows upon rows of polished seats curved gently toward a stage framed by enormous national flags. Behind the podium hung the insignia of every military branch. The ceiling disappeared so high above us that voices carried for several seconds before fading. A protocol officer welcomed us. There will be no applause during rehearsals. He smiled politely. There will probably be plenty during the ceremony. The recipients exchanged small laughs. There were 24 of us. Different ranks, different branches, different careers. One naval commander had served 30 years. A flight surgeon had spent 2 decades leading emergency medical deployments. An engineer had rebuilt critical infrastructure after multiple disasters. Looking around the room, I noticed something remarkable. No one was trying to impress anyone. There was no competition. Recognition has a curious effect on people who never chased it. It makes them surprisingly humble. During the lunch break, I found myself sitting beside a brigadier general whose name I recognized immediately. General Marcus Whitfield. His operational leadership was studied in military academies. I'd quoted one of his logistics papers during advanced staff training years earlier. He smiled as he opened a bottle of water. Captain Carter. Sir, I've been hoping we'd finally meet. I blinked. You know who I am. He looked genuinely amused. Half the command structure knows who you are. I laughed quietly. I find that difficult to believe. Your humanitarian coordination model reduced emergency response times by nearly 20%. He took another sip of water. We've been teaching parts of it for over a year. For a moment, I simply stared at him. The report had been written 18 months earlier. I assumed it had disappeared into some archive after submission. Apparently it hadn't. General Whitfield noticed my expression. No one told you. No, sir. He smiled. That's unfortunate. Then he added something that stayed with me. Real influence usually happens before the person creating it notices. That evening, after returning to my hotel room, I stood for several minutes looking out across the city lights. 3 years earlier, I had driven away from my sister's wedding, believing my story had ended. Instead, it had simply become quieter and stronger. The next morning was the ceremony. I woke before my alarms. Old habit. The uniform inspection took exactly 11 minutes. Every ribbon aligned. Every button polished. Every crease sharp. When I looked into the mirror afterward, I didn't see the frightened young woman who had spent years trying to earn permission to feel proud. I saw an officer, a leader, someone who had become exactly who she had worked to become. Nothing more. Nothing less. Outside the hall, invited guests began arriving nearly an hour before the program started. Veterans wore old medals carefully pinned to dark jackets. Families carried small cameras. Children stared wide-eyed at the uniforms surrounding them. Across the entrance plaza, several buses stopped one after another. Among the passengers stepping down was my father. He looked almost exactly the same as I remembered. Only slower. His shoulders seemed a little more tired. Mother walked beside him, dressed elegantly for the occasion. She looked around with obvious excitement. A volunteer greeted their group. "Welcome." Mother smiled. "We're here to support Colonel James Peterson." The volunteer checked the attendance list. "Wonderful." She handed them their guest credentials. "He's seated with the recipients." Mother accepted the badge proudly. I always knew he'd receive something like this. Dad glanced around the enormous building with quiet admiration. Neither of them had any idea I was already inside. Neither knew my name appeared on every official program waiting on the seats. Because recipients entered through a secure military entrance, we never crossed paths before the ceremony. Perhaps that was for the best. Some moments deserved to arrive without warning. Inside the preparation room, Colonel Harrison adjusted his tie. "Nervous. A little. Good." I looked at him. "Why good?" People who stop feeling nervous usually start believing they deserve admiration. He smiled faintly. "I prefer leaders who still understand the weight of recognition." Sergeant Major Brooks joined us. She inspected my uniform one final time. Without saying a word, she brushed away a tiny thread from my sleeve. "There." I thanked her. She shook her head. "No." "For what?" "For making the last 12 years worthwhile." I frowned slightly. "I don't understand." She looked directly at me. Instructors spend most of their careers wondering whether anyone was really listening. Her eyes softened. "You listened." The announcement came over the speakers. "Recipients, please proceed to the stage entrance." We formed a single line. 24 officers. 24 different journeys. The orchestra began playing beyond the closed doors. Through a narrow gap in the curtain, I could see the audience taking their seats. Thousands of people. Government officials. Senior commanders. Families. Veterans. Civilians. Near the center section, several rows back, I noticed something familiar. My mother's profile. She was speaking animatedly with the couple beside her, occasionally pointing toward the front row where she believed Colonel Peterson would soon appear. Dad sat quietly, studying the ceremony program. I couldn't tell whether he had already noticed the list of recipients. If he had, his expression revealed nothing. An usher approached us. 2 minutes. The line became silent. No one checked their phones. No one whispered. Years of discipline condensed into one calm moment before the doors opened. I took one slow breath. Not to calm myself. To appreciate where I was. Whatever happened over the next hour, nothing could change the years that had brought me here. Recognition doesn't rewrite the past. It simply shines light on work that was already there, waiting to be seen. And in just a few minutes, for the first time in 3 years, My parents were going to see me exactly as the rest of the nation already did. The orchestra finished the opening anthem. The audience rose together. Thousands of people. Thousands of chairs moving almost in unison. The sound echoed through the hall before fading into complete silence. Protocol officers guided us into position. We stood behind the curtain, 24 recipients arranged in alphabetical order. Someone checked a watch. Another adjusted an earpiece. Everything happened quietly. No rushing. No confusion. Years of preparation existed so the ceremony itself could appear effortless. A stage manager looked toward us. When your name is called, walk to the center marker. He pointed toward a small brass circle embedded in the polished floor. Pause. Receive the citation. Face the audience. Remain in position until instructed. Simple. Precise. The master of ceremonies stepped to the podium. His voice carried naturally across the enormous hall. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished veterans, honored families, members of the armed forces, and esteemed guests. He welcomed everyone before speaking about service. Not heroism. Not glory. Service. He described years spent away from home. Ordinary sacrifices that rarely appeared in newspapers. Leadership measured in quiet decisions instead of dramatic moments. As he spoke, I found myself thinking about the drive home from Lily's wedding. 5 hours. Dark highway. One roadside diner. One waitress asking whether I was heading home. I finally understood why that memory had stayed with me. Because that night had marked the beginning of choosing myself. Not over my family. Over the version of myself that believed love had to be earned by becoming smaller. The ceremony continued. The first recipients were introduced. Each citation summarized decades of work in less than a minute. The audience applauded warmly. Families smiled through tears. Colleagues exchanged proud glances. Near the middle of the program, I heard the announcer say, "Our next recipient." The room became still. Is recognized not for a single act of courage. He paused. But for years of exceptional leadership during national emergency operations, humanitarian coordination, and organizational excellence that transformed the way multiple commands respond to crises. A large photograph appeared on the screen above the stage. I couldn't see it. I didn't need to. The announcer continued. Over 14 years of distinguished service. Another pause. Captain Emma Carter. For the briefest moment. Silence. Not confusion. Recognition. Then something happened that none of the audience had been told would happen. General Whitfield rose to his feet. One by one. Every general seated in the front section stood with him. Then every flag officer. Then every senior commander. In perfect unison. They saluted. Not a ceremonial gesture arranged for every recipient. A spontaneous tribute from the officers who had worked with, learned from, or been influenced by years of quiet leadership. The audience noticed immediately. Within seconds, the entire hall was standing. Applause filled the room. Strong. Sustained. Respectful. Not the loud excitement of entertainment. The steady applause people reserve for someone whose work has genuinely mattered. I walked toward the center marker exactly as rehearsed. One step. Then another. Training has an interesting effect. Even when emotions threaten to overwhelm you, your body remembers discipline. I stopped on the brass circle. Faced forward. Only then did I allow myself to look into the audience. My father was already standing. Not because everyone else had. Because he had finally seen the name in the program. His eyes never left me. My mother remained frozen. The ceremony booklet had slipped halfway from her hands. She looked from the giant screen. To me. To the rows of generals still holding their salute. Her expression wasn't dramatic. It was something quieter. The look people wear when reality refuses to fit the story they've repeated for years. She wasn't looking at a daughter in an embarrassing uniform. She was looking at an officer being honored by the highest military leadership in the country. The same uniform. The same medals. Nothing about me had changed. Only the room had. The Minister of Defense stepped forward with the citation. Captain Carter. He smiled warmly. On behalf of a grateful nation. The medal was placed carefully around my neck. He extended his hand. Thank you. Thank you, sir. The applause continued. Longer than protocol normally allowed. I heard the Master of Ceremonies say something I would never forget. Leadership is often invisible while it is happening. He looked toward the audience. We ask that all young officers here today remember Captain Carter's example, that recognition is not something to chase, but something that quietly follows years of honorable service. Only then did the generals lower their salutes. The audience slowly sat down. I returned to my seat beside the other recipients. Colonel Harrison caught my eye from the guest section. He didn't clap anymore. He simply nodded once. The same small nod he had given me years earlier after difficult evaluations. Sergeant Major Brooks wiped away a single tear before pretending nothing had happened. The ceremony continued. Maury awards. Maury applause. Maury remarkable people. Yet somewhere in the middle rows, a woman sat holding a program with trembling hands. For the first time in her life, my mother had entered a room where her opinion was no longer the loudest voice. She had spent years telling me my uniform meant nothing. Now she had watched an entire hall rise because of it. Not because uniforms deserve respect. Because the years lived inside that uniform had earned it. And no whispered sentence spoken 3 years earlier could erase that truth anymore. When the ceremony ended, no one rushed for the exits. Military events rarely dissolve into chaos. People moved with the same quiet order that had defined the afternoon. Recipients were guided toward an adjoining reception hall. Families waited behind a cordoned area until the official photographs were complete. For nearly 40 minutes, I moved from one formal obligation to another. A photograph with the Minister of Defense. Another with the Chiefs of Staff. One with all 24 recipients, standing shoulder to shoulder beneath the national flag. Someone adjusted the angle of my medal. Someone else asked us to shift 6 inches to the left. Everything happened exactly on schedule. Only after the last official photograph did the barriers open. Families began walking toward the recipients. Some ran. Some cried openly. Children threw themselves into parents' arms. Veterans embraced old comrades they hadn't seen in decades. I stood quietly near one side of the hall with Colonel Harrison and Sergeant Major Brooks. Neither of them spoke. They seemed to understand I needed a few moments before facing anyone else. General Whitfield approached first. He shook my hand firmly. Congratulations, Captain. Thank you, sir. I meant what I said yesterday. He smiled. Your work has already influenced officers you'll probably never meet. I was just doing my job. I know. He laughed softly. That's precisely why you're standing here. Another senior commander joined us. Then another. Each conversation was surprisingly ordinary. No exaggerated praise. No dramatic speeches. Mostly stories. Specific operations. Shared memories. Quiet appreciation for years of dependable work. Recognition among professionals rarely sounds emotional. It sounds accurate. Across the room I noticed my father. He wasn't moving. He simply stood there holding the ceremony program against his chest. Mother remained beside him. She looked as though she wanted to walk forward, but no longer knew whether she had the right. Lily appeared a few moments later. I hadn't known she had come. She must have traveled separately after learning the truth. The moment she saw me, she smiled through tears. Then she walked straight toward me. Without hesitation. Without looking around for permission. She wrapped her arms around me carefully, mindful of the medals and uniform. "I'm so proud of you." The words were quiet. Barely above a whisper. Yet they landed with more force than the applause had. I hugged her back. "Thank you." She stepped away, laughing as she wiped her eyes. I spent the entire ceremony pretending I wasn't crying. "You weren't very convincing." "I know." For a few seconds, we simply stood there smiling at one another. No comparisons. No competition. Just two sisters. Eventually, she glanced over her shoulder. "They're here. I can see that. They don't know what to say." "I imagine not." She lowered her voice. "You don't owe anyone anything." "I know." Those words mattered because they came without expectation. She wasn't asking me to forgive. She wasn't asking me to punish. She was simply reminding me that the choice belonged to me. A few moments later, Dad approached alone. He stopped about 2 feet away. Close enough to speak. Far enough to leave if I wished. For several seconds, neither of us said anything. Then he looked at the medal resting against my uniform. "I read every word in the program." I nodded. "I should have read your life that carefully years ago." His voice cracked on the final word. He took a slow breath. "When you were little." He smiled sadly. "You used to bring me every report card before your mother got home." I remembered. "You'd wait in the garage. So I could see it first." I nodded again. "I remember." He looked down at the floor. I thought being quiet kept peace inside our family. Another pause. I've spent 3 years realizing silence also keeps pain alive. Those words surprised me. Not because they erased the past. Because they acknowledged it without excuses. "I'm sorry, Emma." No explanation. No justification. No mention of intentions. Just an apology. Sometimes that's enough to begin healing. Sometimes it isn't enough to repair everything. But it is enough to honor the truth. I reached out and squeezed his shoulder. "I know." He smiled weakly. "I've always been proud." I looked at him gently. "I believe you." He closed his eyes for a brief moment. I just wish I'd been brave enough to say it when it mattered. Neither of us cried. We simply stood together in comfortable silence. After a minute, he stepped aside. Not because the conversation had failed. Because he understood something important. The next conversation belonged to someone else. Mother walked toward me slowly. Every confident movement I had associated with her throughout childhood seemed to have disappeared. She stopped exactly where Dad had. Not too close. Not too far. She looked at the medal. Then at my face. Finally she spoke. "I didn't know." Her voice was almost inaudible. I answered honestly. "No." Another silence. I thought. She stopped. Whatever sentence she intended to finish never arrived. Because there was no version of it that could contain 3 lost years. Or 31 misunderstood ones. I came here expecting to applaud someone else's daughter. She laughed once. The sound carried no humor. I didn't realize the entire country was waiting to applaud mine. I looked at her quietly. She continued. "I spent so much time worrying about who you weren't." A tear slipped down her cheek. "That I never stopped to see who you had become." I didn't interrupt. Not because I agreed. Because this realization belonged to her. People cannot be argued into genuine understanding. They have to arrive there themselves. She took one careful step forward. "I was wrong." 3 simple words. Words I had imagined hearing countless times when I was younger. Strangely, they no longer had the power I once believed they would. Forgiveness had never depended on winning an argument. It depended on becoming someone whose peace no longer relied on another person's approval. I smiled softly, not triumphantly, not bitterly, just peacefully. I'm glad you finally see me. Mother nodded, unable to speak. For the first time in my life, she looked at me without comparison, without expectation, without trying to make me smaller so someone else could feel larger. Just as I was. And somehow, after all those years, that quiet moment accomplished what no confrontation ever could.